Hello, I'm Toussaint Morrison. Most folks assume early LGBTQ activism only occurred in New York and San Francisco, but Minnesota proved to be central to the gay liberation movement. Last week on Minnesota Experience, we witnessed the origins of the first formal LGBTQ organization. We met elders from the trans community, and we visited legendary Foxy's, a bar for women. Tonight, we will introduce you to political pioneers, recall the struggles of the AIDS crisis, and follow along with Minnesota's march towards human rights for all. All these stories and more from out north.
A deepened understanding of race and culture requires the following, and then some more. Truth-telling for immortality, recognition of historical trauma, this free Black child of transgender experience of inner city Chicago, of stifling institutions of white supremacy, of great shoulders to stand up on, of Chris-style dreams, but Andre's reality. Art has the ability to inspire people. And art connects us as human beings on the planet. And it documents our existence on the planet. And to be able to tell our own narrative and tell our own stories. I have the distinct honor and pleasure to have been named the oral historian for the Transgender Oral History Project at the Treasure Collection at the University of Minnesota. I'm just so fascinated with... This morning I interviewed June Remus, who is a 70-year-old African-American transgender woman who had her surgery in 1977 at the University of Minnesota and living an out fabulous life and being a positive role model in our community.
I am female, post-operative transsexual, and I'm from Des Moines, Iowa.
From Des Moines, Iowa?
Yeah, just a little country girl.
Oh, wow. What was it like growing up in Des Moines?
It was nice. It was a small country town type of atmosphere.
Did you come out in small town America? And if so, what was that like?
Well, I came out as a gay boy.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't that hard for me. It was harder for me being a Black male there than it was for me being a transgender there.
Wow. So June, you mentioned that you started at the University of Minnesota, I believe the program in human sexuality.
Yes. I had already been, New York, California, Colorado, to check on who's doing what and what the surgery was and what the results were.
Sure.
And I found that the doctor that was here was doing all the corrective work. I called my mother and I told her I was going to do it. As she hung up on me, she hung up on me and she slammed that phone down so bad, I think she broke that phone. And the day before I had my surgery, the phone rang. I was getting ready to go to the hospital then, and it was my mother. And she said, "Are you still going through with it?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Okay, come and get me." I said, "Come and get you? You live in Des Moines. I'm not driving all the way down there." She said, "No, I'm here at the bus station. Come and get me. I can't let my child go through this without me."
Wow.
And from that day, she never, ever uttered my male name again.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
If you meet June, you can't help but love her, no matter what her identity is. And so those are the kind of stories that I want people to see and be able to have access to.
I've known Andrea for a long time. And that archive is going to be priceless. I knew I was going to be in politics almost as long as I knew I was transgender. I got an opportunity in 1974 to run for city council and get the DFL endorsement. And so I seized it, and it turned out to be quite successful.
I do solemnly swear
but I couldn't have come out at that time. I remembered going to a fundraiser in South Minneapolis in 1978. The house was dark. There were a couple of night lights on. You literally couldn't see who was there. And at first I wondered why this was. Then I said, stupid. It's because there are all kinds of gay people in this fundraiser, and this is the way things are. So I was an elected official, and I was in the closet, and there was at least one other elected official there that was in the closet. And we literally had a in the closet, totally dark fundraiser. Can't imagine doing that now, but that's the way it was. Started out using a therapist in Tappan, New York, and he insisted that I enroll at the same time in the University of Minnesota program. For the simple reason, he said, you need to know other transgender people. You need to know people who are going through the same experience. When we came one night to our monthly meeting, we were going to take a modeling class and learn how to walk. And I said, I'm not going to do that. I said, I'm a feminist. I didn't do this to become a cliche of being a woman. I decided to become a woman. I was married, and my wife, in the end, was very supportive. It took a while for her to come to terms with it. And I began living as a woman on January 1st, 1983.
Returned to City Hall with her recent
In
appointment
1995,
ahead of
I stopped being a Democrat. I gave up being a Democrat. Norm Coleman and I went from being adversaries to friends again. And then he did this extraordinary thing, and he asked me to be his deputy mayor. I didn't see that coming. And so I became his deputy mayor, and I served as his deputy mayor for almost a year. And then in October, on coming out day, I came out as a Republican. In those days, it was clear to me that free markets, free enterprise, limited budgets, all those sorts of good old rock rib Republican values. I don't know where they are now. So who knows what's going to happen? There may be another transition in my life. Story is absolutely essential to this. It's not something that's nice. It's not something that's interesting. It's what produces revolutions. What Andrea is doing at the university is extraordinary in that she's getting on tape the story of all kinds of transgender people and getting it down for all time.
This phenomenon that we call the transgender experience has been happening since the beginning of time.
Two-spiritedness had always occurred. I'm one of the burnt thigh people. My Lakota name is Chentanji, which means yellow hawk. Two-spiritedness was actually a term that was coined here by a group of activists in 1988. It's a reflection of our roles within community, in our tribal communities. Two-spirited folks were the ones who were spiritual leaders. They took care of children. They were consulted upon when a lot of big decisions were made in tribes. Within my tribe, it was always important if you had a name from a two-spirited person, it was told that your child would live a long life. And so people were who they were, and nobody was seen as being wrong. The earlier writings, when you read about the missionaries coming upon Native folks, they talk about men dressing as women. They talk about it in a very negative light. And those were the folks that oftentimes were killed immediately. The spiritual leaders and the two-spirit folks were the ones who were killed immediately, because those were sort of the fabric, the core of the tribe and core of sort of the social fabric. So once you destroyed them, you could destroy a lot of that community. And so early on, they learned to hide two-spirit people. And there were stories about our lives because they knew they would kill us. So they hid us. And it was part of colonization in the boarding school. A lot of those traditional places have been forgotten. We are in the process now of remembering those places and our role and reclaiming them. And it's hard work. We were not in the gay and lesbian community in the same way, nor we are in our tribal communities. I think that the work that folks are doing around leading spiritual ways, being visible is important work. And I think we're all necessary to do that work. After I finished my undergrad, I moved here and got involved immediately in Queer Street Patrol, patrolling the streets of Minneapolis. And so that was my first sort of foray into activism here in Minneapolis. And had heard about the American Indian Gay and Lesbian group here in Minnesota and met Anooksuk, Richard LaFortune. And amazing. Here was this Native person that had integrated this identity of being out as a queer person and a Native person and had them integrated in such a way that there was finesse to it. I write poetry. I've just sort of let it happen organically, and it's a lot of my artist friends who have invited me to do poetry readings and being involved. I've always kept a journal, but over time was my story for my son and my grandson. I always think would be interesting for him to read it. I was just at a Sundance this weekend, and it was so interesting to be there because the Sundance leader and the medicine man actually called it out and said there were two-spirited folks here in the arena and that we were powerful medicine. And a lot of the people came over and shook our hands, and it was amazing to have that much reverence. For me, it's like a reawakening in community.
Losing love makes me sit around and ponder. Absence of your evil make my heart grow fonder. It won't heal.
You are listening to KFAI Radio, 90.3 FM in Minneapolis and 106.7 in St. Paul. Welcome to Fresh Fruit Rare Productions. Minneapolis is a great city. It's a beautiful place. I've lived here my whole life. I think for me, it was a lot about having a cultural support, being Latina, that have family that really supported you. I had a lot of people that really didn't support me, but I think I've had a lot of family and friends that supported me. My mentor is Roxanne Anderson, and I had mentioned to them that I wanted to do radio. And they said, well, I do this show on KFAI Radio called Fresh Fruit Rare Productions. Why don't you come in and sit with me and co-host with me for about a show or two? And I was like, oh my God.
I ain't gotta win a battle, I skate it.
I've been part of the Fresh Fruit family for a good 16 years now. Our history is important.
It is.
Right?
Very important.
Oftentimes we don't get to claim our history, or our history gets
The fact is a lot of racism towards the transgender community, trans women of color especially being murdered across the United States of America, being able to use the restroom of your choice. And it's just really important that we try to focus on those issues.
We're so blessed because
I know.
Andrea Jenkins
Yes.
just walked
Oh my
into the
God.
studio.
I was just
Say happy birthday.
Thank
to my
you.
best friend,
Yes.
Stella.
Thank you.
One of the dopest activists in the Twin Cities.
Thank you. I
Yes.
appreciate it.
to just be able to be a part of that, the oral history project that Andrea does is so worthwhile. I mean, she's legendary in Minnesota, and just all the work that she's done, she's really inspired me. Stay tuned for Encuentro coming up next right here on KFAI. Have a great, amazing night.
We, as transgender and gender nonconforming people, we create our own path, our own destiny, our own selves, our bodies, are literally a work of art. So you are the art exhibition tonight.
Loring Park became a place that people associated both with anti-gay violence, but also with activism. There are so many pivotal stories that happen in the park over the years. Loring Park was a place that was low cost in the center of the city, near service jobs, near Hennepin County Medical Center, which is a common place that people in the community worked, and was also close to things like bathhouses, gay bars, and public sex. So there was a kind of gay male orientation towards Loring Park. Loring Park has been the center of public male and to some extent transgender identified sexuality for a long time. And I think that that is one of the reasons that the park became a center of pride parade.
Pride commemorates the Stonewall riots, usually described as the start of the contemporary fight for civil rights for the LGBT community, which happened in June of 1969. So in June of 1970, a number of cities hosted commemorations.
There were gay prides in, New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago. Jack Baker, who is this kind of iconic individual, gets celebrated in Chicago for his work, and the Minnesotans are embarrassed that he's being celebrated in a different state.
So that was when we decided that we would, in 1972, start having a pride march and parade here in Minnesota.
It was actually not a demonstration as much as it was just a picnic in Loring Park, and it was called a gay pride gathering.
The term gay pride and where it came from was from Tom Higgins, who was a member of Free. He became a monk in North Dakota to attend school, and there he was openly gay, and the Catholic Church was teaching pride as a sin. And so when Tom came back to Minnesota and was very active in Free, he decided to combine two sins of the Catholic Church into one phrase, and that's where the term gay pride came from.
Around the country at this time, it was not gay pride, it was Christopher Street Liberation Day. That's what was being celebrated in New York. It wasn't gay pride being celebrated in New York. So as soon as we hit Chicago, they picked up gay pride, and the next year it was everywhere.
It's an odd coalition of people. So what we have in common is that we don't sleep with each other. We often have very different experiences and very different issues. And when you add into that issues of race and class and geography, it's a complicated coalition.
They added the words transgender. Wasn't much debate on that. It took longer, and the debate was much, much longer for bisexuals.
Back in the late 80s and early 90s, when I was stumping for the inclusion of bi and trans people, I must have talked to at least 40, 50 different organizations, and every single organization I talked to, afterwards, somebody would come up to me and say, I'm actually bisexual, but I don't dare come out because I will lose my credibility as a leader in the gay community. So many times people get pink-washed, is I think one way that people say it, where their identity is glossed over. One big one here in our own community is Ashley Rooks, a transgender woman who she's responsible for the huge success that the Pride Parade is. And she was bisexual, but her bisexuality has been erased. Another one is Andrea Jenkins. She's valued as a transgender person, but so often her bisexuality is just not talked about.
From what I've been told, there are like 4 to 6 organizations in the entire country that are oriented towards advocating for the bi community. And we're really fortunate to have one of those in the Twin Cities, which is the Bisexual Organizing Project.
A group of us went around and talked to a number of organizations, and there have been some changes. I mean, 2 of the first ones that changed was the Community Action Council, which is now out front, and they changed their name deliberately so that it wouldn't be gay and lesbian, that it would include everybody. And also the Pride Committee. The very first year that I know of that the bisexuals were in the parade was '92. And that whole parade, people would go, "Oh my God, you're here!" And they would jump off the sidewalk and march with us. And that's why I got involved with activism in the first place, is that I wanted community where I didn't have to hide my identity.
Getting in a queer space is so important to my mental and physical health, okay? Going around to all the booths and talking to people, and I love to talk to people, and sometimes I talk too much, but that's okay. Running around at Pride, it's not running around at Pride anymore for me. My cane goes with me, but I'll make it around, and oh goodness, don't put the karaoke up there, I'm done.
Pride does grow exponentially in attendance. So that happens as people are coming out exponentially, as identifying with this LGBTQ identity, but it also starts to grow because the heterosexual ally community starts attending as well. And Pride definitely has contended almost since the beginning with being too accommodationist. The very first Pride Guide had this kind of tentative invitation that said non-gays encouraged to attend. So it was kind of like I guess. Major corporations started to get wind of this. In the beginning, it was employee groups, so it was actually LGBT employee groups of these large corporations who decided to come forward, which in the early 90s, was somewhat of a risk.
It has now become enormous. 200,000 people in Minneapolis is not unusual for Pride celebrations now. But I remember those early marches. They really were marches that were more protest in nature than celebration in nature.
Incidents of harassment and assaults on homosexuals have been reported with regularity. 3 homosexuals have been murdered.
We might beat some fags up.
There would be violence, then would lead to actions at City Hall. And so the park would then give life to a whole other set of political alliances.
So to me, it's about our community taking care of each other, and then also connecting with allies in other communities.
There still is gay bashing that occurs, but there was a lot of gay bashing going on. We felt very unsafe. Joel Larson was this beautiful young man who just arrived to Minneapolis.
He was somebody that you would notice in a crowd right away and that you would remember. I think he really fell in love with the city. He liked that it was a place that he felt more accepted than he did in Iowa in the late 80s. I got a call from a very close friend of both of ours, and she told me that Joel had been murdered. And I remember screaming, and it was a bit of a blur after that. I had not been to Loring Park since Joel died. And I walked to the area where he died, and it seemed very dark. And dreary and sad. And then I turned and I looked across the expanse of the park, and all of a sudden it was like he was there with me, and it popped into my head, this thought of turn your back on hate. So from the initial thought of that phrase of let us turn our back on hate, teach love, I felt really strongly that I wanted the memorial bench positioned so it faced away from the scene of the crime and faced out across the park. The actual dedication of the memorial was planned by Joel's sister and her wife, and it was very healing, and that there was a sense of peace and being able to perhaps release a little bit of the grief after all of these years, to know that there was something there, that Joel and his story and what happened wouldn't be lost over time. It's become, basically a permanent part of the park, where anybody that comes through there, they're going to wonder, who's Joel Larson? And just ponder on that thought of let us turn our backs on hate, teach love.
I'll be that angel sitting right on your shoulder. I'll be the star shining to light your way.
People start talking about an Amazon nation, building an Amazon nation. Yeah. And that's what we were all about at that time.
I'll always be here by your side, 'cause I'm still here after I'm gone. In the birds singing.
In the 70s and 80s, there was very much a thread of back to the land movement in the lesbian community, where women felt like being a lesbian in society was overly oppressive.
Both that desire for a separate space coming out of the women's liberation movement, but also the basic economics of the fact that cities privilege men.
I think all of us really felt like, at least I was speaking for myself, damaged by sexism as young women. Our options were really extremely limited, and they were strictly demarcated along what conventional gender lines had been.
I went to Holy Angels Academy, which is in Minneapolis, and the nun would come and drag me out of study hall and take me to her office and say, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I want to be a carpenter. Nah, you can't do that. Well, how about a mechanic? No. Well, I want to be a baseball player. Oh, no. I said, well, what did you drag me in here for, It's when I started meeting the women and at Rising Moon and the Lesbian Resource Center that actually gave me the freedom to go and be on the land.
It always pissed me off that they thought that boys were better or smarter or whatever, and I knew that wasn't true. But then when we went to college, there was nothing. There was no support.
My son always knew since he was 2, and he's always been fine with it. It's never been an issue. I had him till I was 6, and then because I was lesbian, both my parents and his fathers decided he'd be better off with them. And I had no backing, I had no money, I couldn't fight it. So he grew up with his father, and I'd see him every few years, maybe, if he needed a babysitter. Yeah, it was really weird. I went to his high school graduation, and there was all these, I got there late, and there was all these kids lined up on the stage, and I didn't know which one was my kid.
I'd never choose to leave you this early. I offer a different story to tell.
Then I guess our energies toward collectivism started going toward doing these things with women in various collective formations, like doing So's Your Old Lady with Jane organizing it, or helping out at the Lesbian Resource Center, which our friend Karen Brown started. So when did you first hear about the Back to the Land movements? When did you guys first become conscious of it?
Jane told us that she bought that land, and we went to Rising Moon.
Somebody who owned it before needed some quick money, and we had the cash and we bought it. So then we had it, and what are we going to do with it? Because we knew we wanted to be in the country. And we said, let's have a women's community.
So having women around us was a huge part of that, and accepting supportive energy that wasn't critical, that wasn't assuming that we couldn't do things.
That's what we wanted, that's what we were hungry for, that's what we were looking for.
On my dairy farm, I had a bull I used for service, but then when it was time to ship him to market too, these two young men came out to load him, and they got, because he was a bull, they got all excited, and they got him all excited, hitting him and stuff like that, and they couldn't get him to go into the truck. So I said, okay, just be quiet for a minute. And I took a hold of his nose ring and I led him right up the ramp and into the truck. A different energy and a different way of doing things, right? Exactly.
When we started this, or you start any business, you're willing to go without very much money. You work your tail off, you work 16, 18 hours, you maybe get 10 cents an hour, but you're building something. As you get older, as I've gotten older anyway, I've no longer wanted to work quite that hard for a dream. But then the younger kids come along and they've got all this energy and they say, well, let's try to do it without all the machinery. And that's what I think with the cycle, where each generation kind of reinvents idealism, I guess we're talking about.
I will always be wherever you are.
Being on the land with other women, it was about building things with women, community and movements and institutions.
Power.
Yes, exactly. And then what could we create from that energy? If we could get that energy and feel that supported and that much inspiration, what could we do with that? We'd build our Amazon nation with that.
Throughout the late 60s, early to mid 70s, you really have this kind of freedom, this liberation, and the word liberation gets used extensively in this time period. And then by the late 1970s, you do see that the mainstream majority has built a defense now, and there's a backlash.
Stephen Dean was an activist, one of the people that was responsible for the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul adopting gay rights ordinances.
Minneapolis was actually the first unit of government at any level in the United States to pass transgender inclusive non-discrimination language, and that happened in 1975.
In 1974, the St. Paul City Council passes an amendment to its existing non-discrimination ordinance that it's kind of federally required to pass. It extends non-discrimination protections for cases of sexual preference. And so this ordinance is in place for 4 years before it gets swept up into this huge national controversy that gets inspired by Anita Bryant, who is this semi-famous saleswoman for Florida orange juice.
Come to the Florida sunshine tree.
And she was a singer, and she was a runner-up to a Miss America pageant.
Because I dared to speak out for straight and normal America.
She convinces the voting public in Miami-Dade County to repeal this gay rights ordinance. After her success in Miami-Dade County, Anita Bryant and her group, Save Our Children, take the show on the road. So there's kind of outrageous claims that she's making. It's a fear-based campaign.
Anita Bryant had target cities where she was encouraging faith communities to actively work to repeal human rights laws.
Let this historic petition and vote by the people of St. Paul.
There was a Baptist pastor here in St. Paul, and they launched a repeal effort.
All kinds of problems, and every...
Security agents, security agents. No, let him stay.
No.
Let him stay.
Well, at least it's a fruit pie.
Target City Coalition, and Tom Higgins, who put a pie in Anita Bryant's face and waking her up to the reality of oppression of gay people.
Thus always to bigots. Who saw you do that? We welcome you to the Midwest. We hope you come back.
Do you know who saw you do that?
We love you as a person.
This man is.
We love
do you
you
know
as
what
a
kind of
person,
publicity
and
you're going to
We
get?
can't stand the garbage you spout.
Something that is both expressing rage, but also just fundamentally funny. And the fact that Nina Bryant was quick enough to say, at least it's a fruit pie.
It's not bad.
How can we possibly have a law giving special rights to sex deviants without infringing on the rights of our children?
Everyone essentially believed that in the faith communities, nobody would stand up for homosexual people. I believe that we could organize Lutherans to be allies. This is St. Paul Reformation Lutheran Church. This church made a statement of support during the 1977-78 St. Paul Human Rights Referendum, and that put them on my radar, and then I started coming here, eventually joined. They had brought a few gay and lesbian peoples together, and out of that came Lutherans Concerned. Lutherans Concerned was a group of now GLBT individuals who want to help make the Lutheran Church open and welcoming of GLBT people. Now it's called Reconciling Works. This was sort of the seminal chapter here. A friend and I were given the task of seeing if we could find some supportive pastors of various denominations. So we started meeting with bishops or judicatory heads and challenging them to write pastoral letters to their congregations stating that this was a matter of human rights and justice, and the ordinance should be supported and not repealed. And we went around to every bishop's office and got supportive statements. But that taught us an important lesson, and that was not everybody in the faith communities should be automatically written off as the enemy. The door had been opened for groups like Lutherans Concerned, Indignity, which is Catholic, Integrity, which is Episcopalians, Affirmation, which is a Methodist group. Particular rabbis and synagogues had always been supportive allies, and the whole thing started to move forward. We were garnering support from so many different groups, including faith communities, that we had become confident that the repeal would not succeed.
I think they should have the same rights. Yeah, I'll go along with that. They are still human beings, and pay taxes like everyone else.
City Council President Robert Sylvester.
If it's a low turnout, I think they'll win.
And so all of this comes to a head in April of 1978.
So we were all gathered at the St. Paul Hotel, waiting for the results. And at first it looked pretty good, but then you could tell that the negative side was mounting more and more.
So the voting public of St. Paul, by a wide majority, rejects this gay rights ordinance, votes it down. And it was shocking. I mean, it was absolutely shocking. And it's that moment when the reality sets in and that this fight is going to take decades.
Shortly after I was elected and I was coming over to kind of figure out where my office was, I hadn't been sworn in yet, I ran into a legislator from St. Paul who said to me, "Clark, if you think you're going to come in here and pass that gay legislation, forget it. We just threw that out in St. Paul." I said, "What was your name?" That was his introduction to me. He didn't even tell me who he was. It was just like,
There was an ad in the Minneapolis newspaper that said, "Gay rights. Sure, they have rights. They have the right to immediate extermination."
It's one thing to sort of live in a climate of hatred. It's another thing to have that actually thrust into your face in a way that this referendum did.
In the next hour, we'll be looking into that new and frightening medical phenomenon known as AIDS.
course, there's always that thing in the back of your mind that you try to push out all the time that says, I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying.
From 1978 to 1982, you have the repeal of gay rights in St. Paul, and you have the outbreak of HIV/AIDS that completely overwhelmed the entire community infrastructure that got built in the headier days of the 70s.
If I'm one of the few people who has AIDS, I feel that I'm not going to try and pretend reality is different than it is. If anything, I'm going to help people to understand reality as it is.
Bruce Brockway, first person diagnosed in Minnesota with HIV. It was the great shock. The epidemic was coming here. Let's be clear. If you got AIDS, you were dead. By the time Bruce died, he had already been involved with creating the Minnesota AIDS Project. And the AIDS Project was important because there were people in the city of Minneapolis who said, we need to be doing something here. And they were trying to find ways to get resources into the community. So you needed something like the Minnesota AIDS Project.
You guys see one of those? Everybody see one of those?
I would like to work, but people will not hire me because they're afraid the public will find out that I have AIDS.
There was a pervasive culture of fear and misinformation regarding HIV and AIDS.
If Paul, that's in the hospital, if he knew that he was right, why is everybody treating him like a leper? The Lord will smite you with consumption and with fever and blight and with mildew, and they shall pursue you until you perish.
I had started a new job. They just started doing screening for HIV as part of that process. And a few weeks later, I sort of unceremoniously get this letter in the mail that says, you have abnormal blood work. Please go see a doctor so we can release the results to you. Well, I knew enough by then what that meant. In the more private moments, I was just coping until one day, I realized, oh my gosh, I just signed a loan document on a new car. I guess I'm not planning on dying soon. And that really became important, though, because that, along with a few other things, made it much easier for me both to be much more public about being a gay man, but also much more public than about the responsibilities I had to let people know that I was a person living with AIDS.
The AIDS crisis hit me personally. My sister, she's a straight woman, is HIV positive. And her health has gone, she's living a long time with it, but it's being affected.
Yes, I've lost, at least a dozen friends. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. It's kind of, I hadn't thought about that for a while. I would say that because of the AIDS epidemic, there was almost a higher consciousness for me that came out of that. The Aliveness Project was a project for people with AIDS. Housing, food, anything that they could do to help someone in that situation. For the Aliveness Project, I used to do fashion shows at the 90s because I saw all these, beautiful people, just kind of hanging around doing nothing, So I said, hey, why don't we get together and do a show and do it for a cause, and that was, once again, something, important to me for at least, I think 3 to 4 years we did it.
It's sort of like having a deadline, deadlines make you get things done. And it's like, I don't know what my deadline is, but I'm just more aware that there's one out there.
Silence was death. If the most important thing that a gay person could do was to come out, then I realized The most important thing that I could do once I discovered that I was HIV positive was also to come out about that. And that there needs to be somebody who's willing to speak truth to power.
Lorenzo told me that the last thing that Tony wanted to sense before he died was the taste of a strawberry.
That piece is both a story of friends that I had lost at that point in the AIDS epidemic, but it was also a story of each of those buildings on Hennepin Avenue between 6th and 7th Streets, part of the block that I had lived on in the early 80s. I told a story about a building and a story about a friend and a story about a building, and I had footage of that block being demolished. I actually played the Super 8 footage in reverse, so it went from rubble to seeing what had once been there. To play it backward gave some sense of somehow we will get through this.
There was a showing of the Names Project AIDS quilt on the mall area. And I was so impacted by that, I thought we've got to bring that to Minnesota. And there was just this tremendous outpouring of people who wanted to help. We had the showing inside the Metrodome. We had had panel making workshops for Minnesota to add to the quilt, and these panels were very moving. Each panel was actually the size of a coffin. And it began to change the shape of the conversation.
The emerging years of the gay liberation movement, it was a pretty sexist time.
In those days, there was a big division. There really was a big division.
Getting gay men and lesbian women to work together wasn't always easy. And I should be clear, that is an environment that was largely a white environment. So even bringing in issues of racial diversity within this movement and this community was hard to deal with. But one of the things that did happen when the AIDS epidemic really took its grip on the queer community, it was the strength and the culture and the practice of lesbian women that saved us. They are the ones who came and made organizations like Minnesota AIDS Project work.
I spent a couple winters delivering food to gay men with HIV/AIDS. And I know other sisters and brothers who would do whatever was necessary to help out. I at one point I owned a duplex in South Minneapolis, and I rented to a queer brother who had HIV/AIDS.
And they were the ones who, in that moment, also took charge of carrying forward the human rights agenda that was still important to the queer movement. And right alongside with making sure that we were dealing with prevention, we were making sure people were getting access to social services and the health care they needed to stay well, was the political fight and the larger fight to assure that people had basic human rights.
Representative Karen Clark had come up with the idea of asking the governor to create a task force around what came to be called hate crimes. That passed, somewhat surprisingly. So I was talking with Representative Clark and I said, Karen, why don't we try this around the human rights amendment? Because if we can get that passed at the state level, then we don't have to do this city by city thing. So she said, that's a good idea, let's do it. And she submitted that to the governor, and the governor approved it, and we were off and running.
So one of the things that we knew we had to do when we were trying to add sexual orientation to the Minnesota Human Rights Statute. We knew we had to build the base throughout the state. You have to get the votes to pass a piece of legislation, right?
Out front, the Gay and Lesbian Community Action Council, I think it was still called at that time, was able to help shape a campaign.
When we started to look at the civil rights law, we knew that we wanted to have sexual orientation with a broad meaning, but that didn't just happen overnight. It was really, I can give credit to It's Time Minnesota and others who decided, we need to build grassroots support.
Do you know of anybody in greater Minnesota?
And it's always been about making sure that the legislators who represent the whole state understand what the basis of this civil rights law is, why this is a civil rights issue, and that they themselves can feel comfortable enough to vote for it.
This, to me, is a basic human rights issue. And if it costs me the election the next time around, I'm willing to take that risk.
Thank you.
A group that we had hosted here at St. Paul Reformation, PFLAG, Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gays, was building momentum. And so now you had angry parents who were absolutely disgusted that there might be discrimination against their gay or lesbian child. And so they were calling legislators.
For us, this has been a way to support not only our daughter, but the sons and daughters and the brothers and sisters of people we know and care about.
I think we need to get out and cheerlead the community. Okay, here's how easy it is to swing. Now we've got to pull it back again, and let's get to work. And Sue Anderson called from Duluth this morning. Timothy talked to her. She's putting together an emergency meeting on Saturday of 20 people. They're going to start phone banking in Duluth.
Suddenly, this whole grassroots thing was emerging and visible and vocal and organized. I used to describe it as an event from where homosexuality was sort of that which dares not speak its name to that which just won't shut up.
It's a matter of making it's not gay rights, it's about human rights for gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender people.
Minnesota did this a little differently than other states, which was a broader description of what sexual orientation meant so that it included gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. And in the end, we didn't name the 4 categories. We made a broad enough definition that it absolutely included transgender, and we agreed to fight to the death to keep it in there.
Change is hard. It's hard for people to accept change. Any changes that we've had that have promoted justice on the basis of civil rights justice on the basis of laws have always been resisted, and people have always had great fears.
The point that I want to make is that coming out of the closet, if it's like what was demonstrated in those public parades, which demonstrated their lifestyle, was the most sexually outrageous act that could ever be put on the public streets of this state or the state of any state.
Senator Shemilevsky, I'm out of the closet too. And you've known me for 20 years.
Members of the Senate, there's a great element of fear. But I will tell you, if we pass this, the House passes it, the governor signs it, it is the right thing to do.
The motion is adopted.
It's a very impressive victory margin. The language between the Senate and House bills is very similar.
We passed the law with a broad definition. I'll never forget, Senator Alan Speer, dear colleague, he had some real questions in the beginning, and by the time we completed that community process, he was one of the strongest, supporters of making sure we had that language.
The state law passed in '93, and then it was the following year there was the Great March on Washington. Well, I will never forget seeing Alan Speer at the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on the Great March saying, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender human rights. And I said, yes, we did it.
thing that I found super beautiful about Minneapolis was the fact that they do have spaces, they do have bastions, and quite frankly, there's a lot more of our elders still alive.
A lot of the work that's been done opened the door, created the path. It's just important to not lose sight of that and to hold it close. I'm very confident that the next generation or two will be able to do that as long as we hold on to what we have. And I like to listen to what young people think needs to be done, so I could ask the question, what are you going to do in the future?
I plan to attend Augsburg College next year. It's going to be on a leadership scholarship called Act 6. I'm going to study pre-med, mainly because I am a science geek and always was. I don't know how I fell into political things. Maybe it's because my body's a political statement. I just really want to become the first openly trans surgeon in the United States. So that's how I can practically lead my activism and what I'm passionate in at the same time.
Out North is a Twin Cities PBS original production made possible by the Piper Family Fund of the Minneapolis Foundation, with special thanks to David Piper. Funding for community engagement is provided by the Attucks Hoke Fund of the Minneapolis Foundation and by Health Partners, supporting health and well-being for all. Additional support provided by